Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatics show. So today is going to be a continuation. I decided, and I've been uploading a few videos around it, but I decided to do a series of where I'm going to be talking about all of the movies directed by Martin Scorsese, who is one of my favorite directors of all time. He is still so incredibly prolific, and his last film, the whole inspiration for doing this new series is getting got the chance to see his latest film, Killers of the Flower Moon. I saw that in the theater a couple weeks ago, and it's an amazing film. And realizing that he just turned 80 years old and he is still just knocking things out of the park, I was like, I gotta do this. Basically, I've talked a lot about Martin Scorsese's career, how he's one of my favorite directors of all time, and I think he is just a really inspiring person. Whenever you listen to him talk, it's like a free lecture on the history of film. He is a walking, a living, breathing encyclopedia of film, the history of film. It's the knowledge that he possesses is kind of uncanny. So and he talks about how he basically, that's how he grew up. He developed as a human being from from his exposure to film, growing up as a kid, where he essentially was coming from this incredibly poor background, and where he was essentially illiterate and failed terribly in school. He was he got all of his formal education pretty much through film, and getting a sense of his literary sense, his sense of the world, uh, you know, social issues, even learning things from a historical perspective. I mean, all around. He talks a lot about how films have they literally shaped his life. So, very, very interesting. And he learned about films, or he learned about the world around him through films. And he's talked a lot about where when he grew up, he was essentially could not read. He was illiterate, and his family was illiterate, and he also was illiterate, and he learned how to read, and he never read books until much later in life, but he learned about the world around him and about himself through watching cinema. So it really was, kind of the main part to his like development. And along the way, his knowledge of film is just, kind of unparalleled. If you see interviews with like great directors like, say, Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino, there is that same kind of thing of where, every ounce of their being is immersed in film, and their knowledge of film is staggering. But every time I watch Scorsese, like there's been so many movies where anytime I see interviews with him, he always references certain films, a lot of obscure films I've never seen. And I just from watching some of his interviews and reading interviews with him, I have like learned so much. And there's been so many films that I have like checked out. One movie in particular, which is like fairly recent, that I also did a show on, and I just recently bought on DVD, is a John Wayne movie, The Searchers, directed by John Ford. And it's an American masterpiece, and this is a film that he's talked a lot about. Scorsese has talked about in various interviews as being one of his biggest influences. So and there's many examples of that happening. So that's one of the reasons I look forward to anytime I can come across an interesting interview with him, just because of his knowledge. It's a kind of a bottomless ocean of insight, and just tremendous. So, after seeing Killers of the Flower Moon, and I have always talked about Scorsese in some capacity, like his name has always come up in a lot of these videos. Decided, well, one of the biggest things I talk about is how I feel he is, without a doubt, one of the most consistent filmmakers around. It's it deserves to be addressed and it deserves to be talked about. So, decided to do a series of videos where we're going to be talking about all of his films. So, very excited. So, today's movie is going to be about Cape Fear. Cape Fear, Scorsese's version of Cape Fear, which came out in 1981, or sorry, 1991, is essentially a remake. And the original Cape Fear, which came out in 1962, stars Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum. I mean, it's a masterpiece. It's an amazing film. Robert Mitchum was, one of Hollywood's, bad boys, if you will. He was, I think, in his heyday when he was alive and such a prolific actor. He was like such a badass, and I think he's like the quintessential badass in so many of those films that came out in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s. Huge Robert Mitchum fan. He plays one of the most, he always plays these really dark and seedy characters. And his character in Cape Fear is just, frightening as all hell. And so, and that movie itself, onto itself, the original Cape Fear is, it's an amazing film. I've only actually seen the original a few times, but and it is a movie that I do need to buy and I do want to see again. But an amazing film, one of the best roles that Robert Mitchum has ever been in. And I think what Scorsese set out to do, and what I think he did really, really well. Uh, as far as I know, it's you know pretty much, well, not really, but it's essentially it is a remake. He decided to remake Cape Fear, which again, even back when this film was directed, trying to live up to the original, that's pretty monumental. That's it's an incredible movie. But I think what what Scorsese did with his remake is incredible. I almost think it is better in some ways than the original. In some, particularly around Robert De Niro's character, I think it's one of his best roles. I think he's like the embodiment of pure, unadulterated evil in this film. Um, just amazing. And of course, the great cast. Juliette Lewis is fabulous in this film. Nick Nolte, um, and Jessica Lange. Just such an amazing movie. It's basically centered on where Nick Nolte plays an attorney, and he sentences Robert De Niro's character to jail for basically he's like this rapist, murderous character, just so vile. And after De Niro, after he serves his time, he decides like he wants to go after the attorney and go after his family to like basically seek revenge on him, since getting him incarcerated, and destroying his life. And it's kind of like a revenge tale. And I think Robert De Niro plays a character, Max Cady, and I think it's truly one of his best roles that he's ever done. And I think as far as like villainous characters, Max Cady is one of the most frightening characters ever. I mean, talk about so brooding and so intense and so violent and just so merciless. Unbelievable, unbelievable. This movie, I remember, I saw the original as a kid. It came out in '91, and I was in high school. I think I was in high school. Might even been in. I think I was actually in middle school when the original came out, and I remember seeing this as a kid. Years and years before the original. I eventually saw the Robert Mitchum version. It's from '62, years and years later. And I didn't realize it was a remake, of course, of the time at the time. But this movie, the original, or not the original, but the Scorsese's version of Cape Fear, just like scared the shit out of me, especially around De Niro's character. So much incredible suspense, and again, it's essentially a remake, and which is really unique for Scorsese. But he did The Departed, which I just did a show on with Leonardo DiCaprio and Matt Damon, which is an amazing movie. That essentially is also a remake, which is interesting because I didn't realize that or find out about that until like a couple of years after I saw that. And that's a little bit of a lesser known film. It's an Asian film, the original, and it came out about 5 or 6 years before Scorsese's Departed came out, but it's essentially a remake. So it's kind of interesting. I have not seen the original for The Departed, the original version, which would be cool to see someday. But I do love the original Cape Fear. It's all black and white. I'm a huge fan of black and white cinema. I've talked a lot about that. But just an amazing film. I think it's one of De Niro's best films. And, Nick Nolte back during that decade was just on fire. I mean, he made so many great films. Jessica Lange, amazing actress. They're both, Academy. They're all three of them are all, Academy Award winners. Juliette Lewis was incredible in that film too as the daughter, but such a great movie, so frightening. The climactic ending of the film that takes place on the boat is just so awesome. The whole thing takes place in Florida, but just an amazing film. It's so intense and so dark. I think I kind of consider this movie uh, to be essentially a horror film. There isn't a a slasher killer per se, like somebody with a who goes around picking people off per se. There is that though with De Niro's character in a lot of ways, but his character in the movie is so dark that I do consider it to be a horror film. And the other film that I just reviewed, actually the last film that I just reviewed of Scorsese, which is a movie I feel is really overlooked. And it's a movie I initially didn't really like, and it's grown on me quite a bit to where I actually really like it a lot. And that is Shutter Island, also with Leonardo DiCaprio. And that movie's tremendous. Have grown to really appreciate that film. And I think that film is another film in Scorsese's career that is definitely has a horror film aesthetic. So it's interesting because Scorsese's known for gangster movies, essentially. Making whenever I think when your average person thinks about or talks about Martin Scorsese, they think about Goodfellas. I think that is probably what he's most well known for. I'd say Goodfellas is probably his biggest film. Um, you know, um, so he's more well known as a director who makes films about gangsters. The interesting thing, though, now that I think of it, Goodfellas was probably, as far as his most popular film. But when I was doing the show the other day on Shutter Island, I was looking up, a little bit of research, and that film actually had that movie out of all of the amazing films that Scorsese has directed. Shutter Island actually was the biggest, the highest grossing film of his career, which is really interesting because that movie I felt was, you know, it was not really given a lot of credit. A lot of people, you know, have come out and said that they don't think it's as good as a lot of his other films. A lot of critics kind of panned it, but it commercially was the most successful movie, and I feel like it's also his least regarded film or highly regarded film. So it's interesting how there's like a weird combination of those things. But Cape Fear is one of my favorite films. And Scorsese is known to be more of a filmmaker who tells stories about gangsters, but But he's got a real varied career. I mean, The Aviator, for instance, Hugo, even The Departed. Even though that does have elements of organized crime in it, um, really, really diverse. Kundun, Silence, very different films, and then of course Casino. I'm gonna eventually get into all of these films, but he's generally looked at as somebody who makes gangster movies. His films are very very dark for the most part. They show to a degree the seedy side of life, you know, the ramifications of living a life of crime. Um, and But Cape Fear is definitely an incredibly dark movie, and it's I look at it as like a horror thriller, uh, part of the horror thriller genre. It's just an amazing film. I do not own it on Blu-ray or DVD, which is terrible. I My folks have a really good copy of it on DVD, and I've rented it from them a few times, and I've seen it, a bazillion times. That film has always been one of it's definitely been part of like the family classic, a family favorite, if you will. It's a movie we had always watched together growing up, as well as Goodfellas and a whole bunch of other Scorsese films. And I've seen Cape Fear so many times. I do want to get it. I do need to get it on Blu-ray. So at some point I will, and I'm sure it does exist. But an amazing film and one of the best roles for De Niro. Just balls to the wall, suspense, very dark, super brutal. It's a brutally violent movie too. It's De Niro's character again is just incredible, just incredible. So this is Jason Dean, and stay tuned for the next show, which will be on another Scorsese classic. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.